That jar of marinara sitting in your pantry right now is not dinner. It is a metabolic nightmare wearing a red label and calling itself a shortcut. I haven't bought a jar of pasta sauce since I left, and I don't plan to. $5. Remember that number, because by the end of this, I am going to show you what $5 actually buys you, and what it should buy you instead. Stay with me, because what I make instead costs less than the change sitting in your car's cup holder. $1.50. And it does not lie to your body about what it is. I still remember the first time I stood in a grocery store aisle as a grown woman, years after I had left Holmes County, staring at a wall of sauces taller than I was. Rows and rows of jars, every label promising something: organic, home style, garden fresh, and not one of them smelling like anything at all through the glass. I picked one up out of curiosity more than hunger, turned it over, and felt something close to grief. Not because the sauce was bad, because I realized an entire generation of people had never once smelled a tomato actually cooking, and did not know that was even something they were missing. I want to ask you something before we go further, and I want you to actually think about it instead of scrolling past it. How many jars of that sauce have you bought this year? Not guessed, counted. Because most people who ask themselves that question honestly land somewhere between 20 and 40 jars a year, and every single one of them was a small transaction against their own health. Tell me your number in the comments. I read them, all of them, even the ones that argue with me. Here is what most people do not understand, and it is not their fault. Nobody handed them the ingredient list and explained it in plain language, the way nobody ever explained it to me until I left and had to learn everything about the outside world at once, including how to read a label like a warning sign instead of a recipe. You are not just paying $5 for a jar of tomatoes and herbs. You are paying $5 to bring soybean oil and canola oil into your kitchen, dressed up as a wholesome Italian dinner. These are inflammatory seed oils, and they do not belong anywhere near a slow-simmered sauce, because a real sauce was never made with them in the first place. We didn't read labels growing up. We didn't need to. We made it ourselves, and there was no ingredient list longer than 4 words, because there was nothing to hide behind a list of words in the first place. And here is where it gets interesting. Stay with me. The tomatoes used in most of these jars are not vine-ripened. They are industrial, acidic, harvested green and gassed into colour later, and on their own they taste metallic and thin. So the manufacturer has a problem: a sauce that tastes like a tin can. Their solution is cane sugar, and not a pinch of it. Spoon after spoon, hidden across a serving size small enough that the grams look modest on the label. You are not just tasting sweetness that does not belong in a savoury sauce. You are absorbing a sugar load your body was never asked to handle at dinner. And that quiet spike in your blood sugar is the real cost of that $5 jar, long after the receipt is thrown away and the jar is sitting empty in the recycling bin. My Aunt Verna used to say something I did not understand until much later in life. She said, "A sauce that needs sugar to taste like a tomato was never made from a good tomato to begin with." She grew her own Romas along the south side of her garden, right up against the fence line, and by the middle of summer they were so ripe they nearly split open in your hand before you even cut into them. Nobody added sugar to anything she cooked. There was nothing bitter or metallic left to cover up. Now, I want to be honest with you about something. This is not a conspiracy of evil men in a boardroom twirling moustaches. It is simpler and in some ways worse. Not because they failed, because a company driven by margins will always choose the cheapest tomato, the cheapest oil, and the cheapest way to mask both, and call it convenience. That is the systemic reason your sauce looks glossy and tastes flat at the same time. It was never built to nourish you. It was built to survive a shelf, a truck, and a warehouse, not your metabolism. And certainly not your family sitting down together at 6 in the evening. Let's talk about what actually happens to those tomatoes before they reach the jar, because this is the part nobody shows you. High-heat pasteurization is what makes that sauce shelf-stable for 2 years in your pantry. And that same heat is what strips away the natural enzymes and micronutrients that a fresh tomato was carrying the day it was picked. What is left behind is closer to flavored water than food. To fix the texture problem that pasteurization creates, manufacturers reach for chemical thickeners and for a phrase printed right on the label that sounds harmless: natural flavors. That phrase is doing an enormous amount of quiet work. It is simulating the taste of something slow-cooked, without anything ever having been slow-cooked at all. And this is where the price and the harm finally meet in the same sentence, because they were never separate to begin with. You are paying what amounts to a 400% markup over the actual cost of water, salt, citric acid, and fillers, and in exchange your body receives inflammatory oils, a sugar load disguised as flavor, and a texture built by chemistry instead of time. That is not a good trade, under any definition. That is not even a fair one. And once you see it laid out plainly, you cannot unsee it the next time you walk down that aisle. Pick up the jar with me for a moment. Turn it over in your hand. Feel how light it is for something that claims to be full of vegetables. That hollow, thin weight that a real, dense sauce never has. The same hollow feeling you get shaking an almost empty jar and hearing more air than sauce move inside it. Read the fine print on the back, the 8-point font nobody is supposed to actually read, the font they seem to make smaller every single year. Soybean oil, sugar, natural flavors, citric acid. Notice the price sticker underneath. $5 for 24 ounces of mostly water and salt. Uncap it and you will catch that flat, almost metallic tang rising off the surface before the herbs even register. The smell of a tomato that never ripened on a vine, dressed up with dried basil flakes to compensate for everything it is missing. That smell is the tell. It was always the tell, and once your nose learns it, you will notice it in every jar on that shelf. I remember standing in my own kitchen the first winter after I left, holding a jar just like that one, feeling almost embarrassed that I did not know how to make something so simple from scratch. Because in my old life, nobody would have dreamed of buying it in a jar at all. That embarrassment is exactly what turned into everything I am about to show you. If you are the kind of person who reads the side of the jar before the front, you already know what's coming next. Because the opposite of everything you just heard costs $1.50, takes about a minute of active work, and starts with 3 tomatoes instead of a factory. I learned how to make this the way most things get learned properly. Not from a class, but standing next to my grandmother's stove in Holmes County, watching her crush tomatoes with her bare hands over a pot, because we didn't own a food processor and didn't need one. She never called it a recipe. She called it dinner. The tomatoes came from a stand down the road, sold by the bushel in late summer for almost nothing. because nobody was paying for a label. They were paying for the tomato itself. I can still see her hands, stained faintly red by the end of August, and I can still hear the particular sound of her wooden spoon scraping the bottom of that same dented pot she used every single year of my childhood. That is the whole difference between her kitchen and that $5 jar. Nothing hidden. Nothing to hide. There was a neighbour of ours, a woman named Ruth, who lived 2 farms over, who used to trade jars of her own preserved sauce for eggs and honey come autumn. And people would ask her for the recipe every year. And every year she would laugh and say there was no recipe, only tomatoes, oil, garlic and basil, and patience. And that the patience was the only ingredient people were usually missing. Here is how you make it, and it takes 4 ingredients, not 40. Vine-ripened Roma tomatoes, cold-pressed extra virgin olive oil, fresh garlic, and fresh basil. Crush the tomatoes by hand or with the back of a fork, skins and all. This releases the lycopene, and lycopene becomes far more available to your body once it meets fat, which is exactly what happens next. Warm the olive oil in a pot over medium heat and add thin slices of garlic just until you can smell it, not until it browns. Pour in the crushed tomatoes, add torn basil leaves, and drop the heat to a low simmer. Let it sit there uncovered, stirring occasionally, until the colour deepens and the sauce thickens on its own, with nothing added to force it. Taste it once near the end and you will notice you are not reaching for sugar to fix anything, because there is nothing sour or metallic left to fix. I will tell you the mistake I made the first time I tried to recreate this on my own, years after I'd left, standing in a rented kitchen with none of my grandmother's patience and all of her confidence, which turned out to be a dangerous combination. I turned the heat up high to save time, the way you rush anything when you are impatient and out of practice, and think you already know better. The garlic burned before the tomatoes had softened, and the whole batch turned bitter in a way no amount of basil could rescue. And I remember standing over that ruined pot feeling almost as foolish as I had felt the day I bought my first jar of store sauce. Low and slow is not a suggestion here. It is the entire method. The moment you respect that, the sauce respects you back. While it simmers, the kitchen fills with something a jar can never give you. Warm garlic and basil rising in the steam, thick enough that you can feel it on the back of your throat before you even taste anything. The exact smell that used to drift out through my grandmother's screen door and down the porch steps so that you knew what was for supper before you ever reached the kitchen. That smell alone tells you more about what is actually in the pot than any label ever could. Weigh the finished batch against a standard jar from the store, and you will find you have made more sauce, denser and richer, for a fraction of what that jar cost you, with tomatoes and oil that together run about $1.50. I want to be honest about the limits of this, because I am not here to oversell you on anything. And honesty was something I was taught to value long before I ever learned to make a video. This sauce will not sit in your pantry for 2 years. It belongs in the refrigerator, used within about a week, or frozen in portions if you want it to last longer. Vine-ripened tomatoes are not always sitting on a shelf in the middle of winter, the way a jar always is, so there will be seasons where this takes a little more planning than simply grabbing something off a shelf. I remember one January, years ago, wanting that same sauce and finding nothing worth using at the store and having to wait, and being reminded that some good things simply cannot be rushed into every season of the year. That is the honest trade. Less convenience, in exchange for something your body was actually built to recognize as food. Look at the colour difference side by side, and you will see it before you ever taste it. The homemade version holds a deep, almost brick red, alive and slightly uneven, the way real food is uneven. The jarred version sits dull and faintly brown, flattened by heat and time before it ever reached your table. Freeze this in small portions and you will never again find yourself standing in a grocery aisle at 6 in the evening, tired, reaching for a jar out of convenience instead of choice, the way I did more than once before I finally sat down and taught myself to do this properly. This is not really about tomatoes, and it was never only about $5. It is about noticing how many small, ordinary decisions in your kitchen were quietly made for you by a company that has never once tasted what they sell you. Taking that decision back, one pot, one ingredient list you can actually pronounce, is a small act. And it adds up over years into something that looks a great deal like control over your own health. My grandmother never once used the word health when she cooked. She simply cooked the way she was taught, and it turned out to be the same thing all along. Tell me in the comments the one product in your own kitchen you suspect is doing this same thing to you. I want to know which jar you are looking at right now. $5 for a jar of flattened, sugar-masked water was never a bargain. It just wore the costume of one. $1.50, 4 ingredients and a smell that fills your whole kitchen instead of a label you have to squint to read. That is the whole trade, laid out plainly. I haven't bought that jar since I left. I still don't plan to.